Tonight on World Report, a dictator under siege, but his billions of dollars safe and sound.
You need offshore funds. Where banks are accepting money that comes from corrupt sources, they are effectively allowing dictatorships and tyrannies to continue.
Why does the US and its allies allow bad guys to steal their country's money and put it into Western banks? What we should be doing about billionaire despots' deposits. Also tonight, a long-held family secret revealed when a photograph is discovered.
What did you do when you saw this photograph?
Well, I was absolutely incredulous at first. I couldn't square at all this girl I was seeing in the photograph with the mother I knew.
Jasmine Darznik thought she knew her mother, but when she listened to these tapes, she realized she didn't. And later, she's been the workhorse. And this week, one last mission for Space Shuttle Discovery as NASA winds down the shuttle program. All this tonight on World Report. Now, reporting from London, England, here's Jennifer London with her story, Show Me the Money.
This secluded, upscale London neighborhood is a far cry from the violence in Tripoli, but there's a connection. An 8-bedroom mansion owned by the family of Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator who, rather than relinquishing power, opted to massacre his own people. The price tag for this posh vacation home? $16 million. And that's just the beginning. $20 million for a stake in an Italian soccer team, $22 million for the development of a luxury spa and water bottling plant in the Italian countryside. And then the fleeting signs of a lavish lifestyle, like the New Year's Bash in St. Bart's, with live performances by Beyoncé and Usher. In other words, Libya's ruling family is extraordinarily rich. The family's net worth may top $90 billion, with assets hidden across the globe.
The overall amounts of money that they've got or have taken, we can never be precise about, because it's like measuring a black market. You don't know the total amounts of money that have been stolen.
Anthea Lawson works with Global Witness, which fights corruption in regimes around the world. She is one of the foremost experts on how dictators make and hide their money.
These dictators are getting extremely wealthy on the backs of their own people, and the international community doesn't seem to do anything until what?
Until we see these regimes toppling and people out on the streets and people getting killed. You know, this is what's so awful about what's happening in Libya. You know, there are people being killed by their own government, and it's taken until that point for anything to happen.
In an interview with ABC News, Gaddafi's son Saif not only denies there's been any violence in Libya, but also denies that his family is wealthy.
First of all, we don't have money outside. We are a very modest family, and everybody knows that. And we were laughing when they said we have money in Europe or Switzerland or something. It's a joke.
The joke is on anyone who believes him. The evidence shows that Gaddafi's family lives the high life, while about 1/3 of Libyans live at or below the poverty line. This, even though Libya's one of the most oil-rich countries in the world. But Gaddafi is not the only billionaire dictator around. Pick a tyrant, and you'll probably find a fortune. In Tunisia, this man, deposed President Zain El Abidine Ben Ali, is believed to be worth about $5 billion. In Egypt, before Hosni Mubarak was deposed, he amassed a vast fortune worth tens of billions. Not far from the Gaddafi's estate in North London, Mubarak's son Gamal owns this townhome in Knightsbridge. Properties in this neighborhood typically sell for $10 million plus.
Can you give me an overview of how some of these dictators are accumulating their wealth? What are some examples of how they're becoming billionaires?
You might set up a front company, and if you're responsible for trading your country's oil, you might trade it at below the market price to your own company and then sell it onto the market once you've disguised that it's your own company doing it, and split the difference with your cronies and embezzle some money that way. One of the other classic ways to engage in corruption is by ensuring that you are cut into every deal that happens in your country. And I think this is one of the things that may have been happening in Egypt and Libya, which is that the ruling family will ensure that they have a stake in all of the deals that are done.
Revenue that should benefit the whole country instead often ends up in the personal bank accounts of tyrants.
Isn't it obvious, though, that with regard to Mubarak and Gaddafi, that there is no way that their wealth could have come from their official salary as a head of that state?
What we see in these situations, though, in Libya, for example, or in Egypt, is that there are so many businesses that they're involved in that are benefiting from their role also as head of state, that it starts to become obvious that that is beyond what an ordinary businessman could get.
They would have to be some of the most successful businessmen ever to have accumulated the fortunes that they do.
Tim Daniel is a London-based lawyer who specializes in recovering assets stolen from countries through corruption.
Is anybody asking how Gaddafi could come up with $20 million to buy a 7.5% share in an Italian football team and buy a mansion here in London that is in a neighborhood where the townhomes sell for $10 to $20 million, and that's just the tip of the iceberg regarding the vast amounts of wealth he and his family have accumulated over the 40 some odd years that he's been in power. Is anybody asking, where's this money coming from?
If they're not, they should be, is the short answer. What I anticipate, particularly with the Libyan situation, is there is this Libyan Investment Authority, which we're reading in the press is a fairly shadowy organization itself.
This is the London headquarters of the Libyan Investment Authority. The LIA owns properties all over the world, and plenty here in the UK, like an office and apartment building a few blocks away, purchased for about $10 million. And Portman House in downtown London, a $250 million retail center with annual rents estimated at $18.5 million. The LIA also has an interest in Pearson Group, which owns the Financial Times and Penguin Books.
It will no doubt be argued that all the monies that are being invested through that authority are in fact Libyan monies and belong to the Libyan people. Okay, fine. Just so long as those monies go back to the Libyan people, or there is sufficient oversight back in Libya to ensure that those investments really are for the Libyan state and not for the benefit of members of the Gaddafi family.
It's possible some of these investments are legitimate. Others could be fronts for the Gaddafi family. If you're confused, you should be. So is the international community. But attorney Tim Daniel suspects very little money gets past the Gaddafis. It's laundered through dozens of companies controlled by the family.
There are, after all, 9 sons, and so you can spread quite a few billions through those sons. And as I said, another feature of this is that they always tend to be family organizations, why it is terribly important that the politically exposed persons include the family.
So we're really talking about money that is stolen from the people.
Yeah.
We're not talking about Gaddafi's money. We're talking about the money that belongs to the people of Libya.
Yes, at the end of the day, that is what it has to be.
And the money can only go out if we allow it to come into our banks. There's no point stealing billions of dollars if you're going to keep it under your bed.
But what about the banks that are accepting this money? And why aren't the banks saying, where's all this money coming from? Your people in Libya are very poor.
Banks have a duty to establish who their customer is, what the source of wealth is, and whether that explanation for this money is reasonable under the circumstances. So the question that is now really important to understand is, have the banks been doing that with Libya's money?
Have they?
Well, we don't know, because we don't know what the banks have been doing, because this all happens behind the wall of bank secrecy, and that's what allows all this to go on.
That and Western governments' complicity. After all, the U.S. and its allies have been doing lots of business with lots of bad actors.
I hear bankers saying this to me all the time, which is, why should we not do business with this government when our own government is doing business with them? The UK has lots of investments. We give aid to Egypt. We're all buying oil from Libya. So as long as the governments are wanting to do business with them, it sets a tone for the overall relationship. which I think, to give credit to the banks, that's the context in which they're doing their due diligence.
Now, the U.S. and a number of European countries have frozen Gaddafi's assets and those of his family. So far, a record $30 billion in the U.S. alone. But they've been well aware of Gaddafi's financial transgressions for years. This is a U.S. State Department cable released by WikiLeaks. The subject, Gaddafi Incorporated. It clearly states that in Libya, the politically connected elite has direct access to lucrative business deals. The cable is dated May 2006.
And the cable then goes to list money from oil and gas, money from hotels, tourism, money from media, telecommunications, and nobody was talking about trying to freeze Gaddafi's assets when this cable was published back in 2006. And now, given what we're seeing in Libya, there's this huge outcry that his assets have to be frozen. And I keep going back to the question of why now? Why not then?
It's only become available in the public domain as a result of the WikiLeaks diplomatic cable leaks, which took place towards the end of last year. And suddenly people realized that, in fact, the US government had been on notice that there were all these activities. And you're quite right, no action had been taken. Why not? I'm afraid you'll just have to ask the US government what the answer to that is.
We tried, and the State Department would not comment.
You say that these calls for the seizure of his family's assets is too little too late. What do you mean by that?
If they are sufficiently concerned about this money and how clean it is, that they're calling for it to be frozen, then what on earth were they doing, allowing their banks to accept it in the first place?
Now Lawson's watching the cycle begin again, this time in another oil-rich African nation, Equatorial Guinea. Global Witness has issued this report on the ruling family there. The nation's natural resources allow for a comfortable per capita GDP of $38,000 a year, but most of its people live on less than $1 a day.
Its population are suffering horrendously. The money has not benefited people's lives at all. In fact, living indicators have gone down. Infant mortality has increased since oil was discovered in Equatorial Guinea, and that is because the money is disappearing. So let's take our friend Teodoro Obiang. He's the son of the president. He's a minister in his dad's government. He earns $5,000 or $6,000 a month, and he owns a $35 million mansion in Malibu. He also has a private jet in the US that costs $33 million, and he owns a series of really fast cars. He owns 3 Bugatti Veyrons. Just one of those cars would have paid for a mosquito net for every child in that country. This is a place where children die of malaria, and it's a major cause of death.
Are we seeing a correlation between the extreme wealth of these dictators and the extreme poverty of the people in their respective countries?
Well, it does certainly seem to be the case that wherever there's an example of a kleptocrat who has managed to siphon off a large amount of money from their country's treasury, that there is a corresponding amount of poverty. The terrible irony of this is that a lot of these countries are actually very wealthy. If you measure what they've got and what it is they're selling, a lot of them are selling oil. They've got other minerals. So there's real value here which these countries could be harnessing to get themselves out of poverty, if only the money wasn't going out.
Fleecing these victim countries isn't just about who wins, who loses money. It's about who gets to hold the keys to the kingdom.
Corruption is what enables dictators and tyrants to stay in power. If you are trying to stay in power against the will of your people, you can do it through force, which means you've got to pay your sort of private bodyguards and security forces. You've got to make it worth their while. And you've got to pay people off so that your opponents don't start massing against you. You need offshore funds and access to ready money in order to be able to do that. So where banks are accepting money that comes from corrupt sources, they are effectively allowing dictatorships and tyrannies to continue.
That sounds really horrific, and it's a really bold statement, because if you take that to the logical extreme, you're basically saying the banking industry is indirectly responsible for Mubarak and for Gaddafi. And all the terrible things that
Yeah.
those two regimes have been able to do. Is that in fact what you're saying?
It's the City of London, it's Wall Street, it's Dubai, where a lot of the money goes now, it's Singapore, it's all of these major banking centres.
It doesn't seem like anything is done until the dictator is deposed, in Mubarak's case, or in Gaddafi's case, there's civil unrest and it becomes a question mark what will happen with his regime. Why? Why is that the case?
Well, if you were a politician, you'd call it realpolitik, and if you were a cynical activist, you'd call it hypocrisy. Basically, if it's our guy that we're dealing with, then the message is, let's go ahead and do business. It's really sad, and it's very hypocritical that we've had to wait until Libyans are dying on the streets to get to a point where we're having a conversation about where the money's going. It should have happened long before now.
It would be extraordinary for a government, say the UK government, to have started proceedings against Gaddafi a year ago. After all, they'd been doing arms deals with him, they'd been drilling for his oil, buying his oil, etc., etc. And there's no way that that status quo was going to be upset.
If you wait to freeze the assets of these dictators and autocrats after they've been deposed, they've already made off with their millions and billions, and their people are left suffering with barely any food to eat, et cetera, et cetera. So is it too little too late to do that?
Efforts to recover assets on behalf of states have been extraordinarily ineffective. And I say that against myself, very much engaged in this area of business. The World Bank reckoned that 30 to 40 billion comes out of developing countries illicitly each year. The sum total of recoveries to date, and this is going back way back when, is 5 billion.
Anthea Lawson is clear the cycle can only be broken before it starts, before dictators steal billions from their people.
Now, in all cases when it comes to corruption, the solution is, I'd call it sunshine tactics, the bright sort of disinfecting power of sunshine. And what that basically means is transparency. So some greater transparency about which banks the money is in, greater transparency about which banks are lending to which governments, increased transparency about the oil revenues coming in so that there's some accountability about how they're spent. Transparency in all these things is what will give the people of countries run by dictators and tyrants a chance to see more about what's going on.
And transparency in how Western governments deal with these dictators before they're deposed and before there is bloodshed in the streets.
Coming up, a long-lost photograph reveals a stunning family secret.
I was going through some of her old letters. This photograph fell from a stack of papers, and other pictures just fell into my hands by accident.
A woman confronts her family's dark past. That's next. But first, here's a World Report Index.